Here's how to change a timing belt, water pump, cam and crank seals on a Toyota with a V6 3-liter engine. The timing belt on this car is roughly 8 years old, so it's due for replacement. The timing belt is located under this cover here. To get access to it, we need to remove the engine mount and its bracket, the strut bar, and the accessory belts, as well as the alternator bracket. Here I'm removing two 14mm bolts that hold the engine bracket on. One 12mm bolt. Remove the coolant reservoir. And then this 14mm bolt that holds the dog bone mount on. There's also one more over here. Remove the engine mount and also the bracket. Remove the strut bar. Next we're going to loosen the alternator pivot bolt. Now we can remove the alternator belt from the crank pulley and AC compressor. Next I'm going to remove this nut at the bottom of the stud here. It's a 12mm. Then remove the alternator bracket. Disconnect these two ground wires so that we can get them out of the way. There's a couple of clips here you can undo to release the wiring harness. One over here, and there's also one here to release it from the timing cover and pull it away. With the car on jack stands, we're going to remove this splash plate by removing two 10mm bolts. Okay, now we have access to the bolt holding the power steering. It's a 12mm bolt that we loosen up. Now with the belt slack, we can just pull off the power steering belt. Next I need to remove the crank bolt, which is a 22mm bolt. If you're having trouble removing the crank bolt, you can just put your 22mm socket onto a breaker bar and wedge it against the control arm like this. Disconnect the ignition and blip the starter, and that'll cause the pulley to rotate clockwise and break the bolt. This is the crank puller set I'm going to use to pull off the pulley. I've got my crank puller installed. These are M8 bolts, I believe. So I'm just going to tighten this up and the pulley will come off. That's the crank pulley. Now we can remove the lower timing belt cover. There's a 10mm bolt here, one up there, one over there at the top, and then one over here. Now we can remove the lower timing belt cover. Remove the timing belt guide, making sure you know which side is the belt side. Remove the timing belt plate, which is a 10mm bolt. Make sure you don't lose this. Next I'm going to remove the 5 10mm bolts that hold the upper timing cover on. There's one at the back, two in the middle here, one at the front, and one at the bottom. Alright, now we need to remove the upper timing belt cover. It could be a little difficult because the high pressure power steering hose line is in the way, so we need to wriggle this out. The inside of these timing covers are pretty oily and dusty, so that might indicate that the cam and crank seals are leaking a little bit. Next we need to remove this engine bracket. There's two 12mm bolts that need to be removed, as well as another 12mm nut behind. Remove this engine bracket. Now before you take off the timing belt, it's a good idea to knock the camshaft bolts loose because they can be on pretty tight. Okay, I'm going to use the timing belt tension to get the rear camshaft bolt loose. I've got two breaker bars on a pipe here. You can also use one of these cam adjusting tools to loosen the camshaft bolts. Reinstall the crank bolt. And I'm going to use the bolt to turn the engine over until it's aligned with top dead center. So here I've got the crankshaft at the top dead center position. This dot here has to align with a little notch on the engine. And over here I've also marked off where the timing belt aligns with this dot here, which is your installation mark. We'll need that to reinstall the timing belt. Here I've made a mark on the front camshaft. Here's what the mark looks like when it's aligned on the rear camshaft. If the camshaft access at the back is a little too tight, we can use a little mirror here to align the marks. Next I'm going to release the timing belt tensioner. Now that the timing belt tension is slack, we can remove the belt from the gear. Then we can start removing the timing belt from the top gears. Next I'm going to remove the center idler pulley. It's a 14mm bolt. Remove the camshaft bolt. Take off the rear camshaft. Take off the front camshaft. To get the water pump out, we need to take out this timing cover number 3. There's 6 10mm bolts, 2 on the front camshaft, 2 in the middle here and here, and then 2 on the rear camshaft. Once the wiring harness is loose, we can go ahead and remove timing cover number 3. If you're not doing cam seals, you can get away by only removing the front cam and these 6 10mm bolts holding this cover onto the engine, and then pull it out and pivot it against the rear cam to get access to the water pump bolts, like that. Next I'm going to remove the tensioner idler pulley. It's a 10mm hex bolt. Here's the idler pulley. You can pull off the crank timing gear. There are M6 threaded holes here if you need to use a puller and it's stuck on. Make sure you don't scratch the sensor surface here. You can have a look at the crankshaft pulley. In this case it doesn't look like it's leaking. Now at this point, before we take off the water pump, we need to drain the coolant. So here I am at the bottom of the radiator. This is the petcock valve that I can rotate and it'll drain the coolant. So here I've got a piece of hose wedged onto the petcock valve and it's draining the coolant into a bucket. This is the water pump. As you can see, mine has a little bit of crap from the timing belt on it. It's a good idea to change these when doing the timing belt. To remove it, there's 4 10mm bolts here that need to be removed, and there's also 2 10mm nuts at the back here that need to be removed. I'm going to remove the water pump. In some cars, if the studs don't clear the fender to take off the water pump, just jack up the engine slightly. Remove the water pump gasket. I'm using the ASIN timing belt kit from Rock Auto. It comes with the timing belt, the tensioner bearing, the idler bearing, the water pump gasket, and of course the ASIN water pump. This is the old water pump. It was manufactured in 1999. It's the original pump for the car. As you can see, it's stamped with Toyota and ASIN. Here is the new water pump from ASIN directly. It was manufactured in 2013. And as you can see, it's stamped with ASIN, but the Toyota logo has been ground out. Making sure all the surfaces are clean first. Next I'm going to reinstall the water pump gasket. And then I'm going to install the water pump. I'm going to torque down the water pump bolts. 69 inch-pounds of torque, specification for the water pump. You can see the front cam seal looks okay, it's not leaking, but the back cam seal here has a lot of oil all over it and we need to be changed. To change the cam seals, we need to dig it out. We don't want to scratch the shaft or the housing, so I'm using a paint can opener. It's a couple of cents from Home Depot. I'm going to gently push it in and pry the seal out. I'm going to use a seal remover tool. You gotta be careful when removing the seals because you can nick up the camshaft like this. I'm going to see if I can use this seal remover tool to get the camshaft seal at the back out. It was a bit of a struggle to get the rear camshaft seal out. I had to use a combination of the seal removal tool, a screwdriver, and also the paint can remover. This is what the seal looks like. It broke apart when it came out. I removed the crankshaft seal using the paint can opener by just pulling it out like that. Before I install the camshaft seal, I'm just going to run a little bit of engine oil around the seal so that it slides in easier. I'm going to go ahead and install the seal onto the rear camshaft. Once the camshaft seals are on, I'm going to use this black piece of pipe. It's 1.5 inches in diameter to tap the seal until it's almost flush with the surface. To get access to put in the rear cam seal, I had to remove the power steering reservoir to clear the hose, so that I can get a hammer in there and hammer it flush, as you can see in the mirror down there. Here I'm going to install the crank seal. Push that into place. I'm just going to lightly tap this in with the PVC pipe. Before I start putting things back together, I'm just going to clean the engine area with some degreaser. Now that the engine's all cleaned up and put back together, it's time to reinstall timing cover number 3. Reinstall these 6 10mm bolts. Reinstall the camshaft. Using the camshaft holding tool, I'm going to tighten down the camshaft bolt. Install the front camshaft here. Tighten down the front camshaft. Reinstall the brand new idler pulley that came in the kit. Down at the bottom, I'm going to reinstall the crank gear. Reinstall the timing belt plate. Put in the timing belt guide. Put in the new tensioner. Make sure the washer's on the back there. And thread in the hex. Here we've got the old belt lined up next to the new belt. As you can see, the marks line up exactly the same. Here's the new timing belt. I'm going to start by installing it on the rear cam and working my way forward, making sure that these marks line up with the camshafts and also the timing covers. So here I've got the timing belt installed. The front camshaft is aligned with its mark, and I use the mirror here at the back to line up the rear camshaft. Here at the crankshaft, I've got the pulley at top dead center, and the mark on the timing belt aligns with the dot on the gear. Next I'm going to reinstall the timing belt tensioner and replace the two 12mm bolts. Once you've double checked all the timing belt marks, we can release the key pin from the tensioner. You can remove these alignment clips here. Make sure the timing belt has been seated properly in all the gears and it's nice and tight. To double check the timing, I'm going to turn the crankshaft over 2 times to check the marks. I refill the cooling system with a 50-50 mixture of Toyota red long life coolant. I've temporarily reinstalled the harmonic balancer so that I can turn over the engine to make sure everything works before I close up. Let's start it up. Reinstall the engine bracket. Tighten down 2 12mm bolts and 2 12mm nuts, remembering the alternator bracket. Reinstall the upper timing belt cover. Replace 5 10mm bolts that hold the timing cover on. And replace the lower timing belt cover. And 4 10mm bolts. Reinstall the crank pulley on the crankshaft. Reinstall the power steering belt. Reinstall the alternator belt. Replace the engine mount bracket. And 2 14mm bolts. And 1 12mm bolt over here. Replace the dog bone engine mount and 2 14mm bolts. Replace the splash plate and 2 10mm bolts. Okay, so I've got everything back together. I've reinstalled the strut bar and also the power steering reservoir and coolant reservoir and replenished those. Make sure that you burp the cooling system and then double check for leaks. Make sure you record the mileage the timing belt was changed. Finally, we're going to start it up and make sure it runs smoothly.